The Alternative Experience.
The Alternative Experience.
The Alternative Experience.
Hey everybody, Nicky Joe here. So, welcome to another episode of Alternative Experience. So, just me this week. I want to go through, it's kind of an article that I wrote for my Medium platform. I don't know if any of you guys read articles or follow me on Medium, but it's from over there. And I just thought I'd put it into a podcast because it got a lot of good engagement on that platform. And obviously not everybody likes to read. Some people prefer to obviously digest their content in this fashion. So what it was all about is understanding our sort of innate tribal nature, mostly so we can build a better future for the entire planet. Now, obviously, there's been a lot going on around the world these days. You can't really miss the polarization. But actually, what happened is the podcast episode I had a few weeks back with Jenny Powers. For any of you that caught that, we were actually discussing one of my favourite subjects and the subject of her new book, which is her book's called The Origin of Being, and it's all about our ancestral history. And while I've been kind of ruminating on it over the last few weeks, and seeing the scenes back in the UK that obviously people have been watching the riots, etc., but I had the realisation, funnily enough, that we're not actually as doomed as we are being led to believe. Now, I think you'd have to be living under a rock on a desert island to have not heard at least one person kind of refer to our tribal nature as if it were, this kill switch, that's going to inevitably lead to our demise. Now, I do understand the world that we currently sort of experience is very polarized. We've continuously sort of divided ourselves and subdivided ourselves into an ever-increasing number of groups. And I think mostly due to social media, but I do think that we now can all accept that our human nature is often used against us either by corporation and their marketing, trying to make sales, or politicians, political parties that are either trying to gain your support or seemingly cause absolute chaos within the population is what they actually seem to do. But our tribal nature, the point I'm trying to make, is very well established. It's highly researched, and as such, we really do know which buttons that we need to press to get whatever response it is that we're looking for. And I think the bigger the button, the bigger that mouthpiece, the wider that message is going to reach. And unfortunately, something I speak about all the time, us as a population have completely forgotten this because we've lost touch with our very own biology. Now, we've got these vital survival mechanisms such as intuition, instinct, but they're now viewed by most people for some reason as spiritual nonsense. And as such, we completely ignore them. So we don't really understand ourselves on this physical or biological or even mental level. And as such, I think even the most suspicious of people can often fall foul of a concerted and slick marketing campaign, or, as I say, a well-executed propaganda campaign if you're not too careful. However, if we took the time to really understand this part of our innate nature, what we would find very quickly is we would understand that there is actually another way for us to really lean into this tribal nature, and it will actually benefit everybody. So are you aware that up to around 10 to 12,000 years ago, the human race had actually survived and thrived for millions of years through cooperation? Now, I was surprised by this as well, but it's correct. While the movies and the history books would like you to believe that early man was aggressive, animalistic, constantly in conflict with everything around them, this is actually not the case. Now, granted, obviously there would have been flashpoints, especially when tribes came into contact and maybe food was scarce and maybe survival was on the line. But generally we see evidence of a highly civilized nature, at least within the tribes themselves. It's only since we really established modern agriculture that we begin to see an escalation in what we would call conflict. Now, let me explain. So for millions of years, we had lived a hunter-gatherer lifestyle. Now, we hunted to eat, we built shelters to sleep, but we were constantly on the move. And as such, we had very little in the way of possessions. Now, due to this lifestyle, obviously it had some obvious dangers. We really understood, I think, by working in a cooperative manner, it would benefit the entire tribe. So there was simply no place for hierarchy or ego. Think about it, it's far easier for you to take down a woolly mammoth in a well-organised group, all with the same end goal, which is simply to fill the belly and enjoy the rest of the day. Now, we would have lived in the moment, and then other than food and company, we didn't really want for anything. You could say that we quite literally worked to feed and shelter ourselves so that we could spend the rest of our time living. Now, since the introduction of modern agriculture, this has obviously changed drastically. Due to the way in which plants grow, that immediate nature of our life ended. So rather than living day by day in the moment, we began to think in a kind of linear fashion. We planted the seeds. We then looked on anxiously 6 to 8 months into the future as we kind of hoped and prayed for a successful crop. And this was also a crop that needed regular care and attention. So those days of roaming instantly came to an end. And this new way of living no doubt created anxieties that we wouldn't have previously experienced, not to mention obviously a far more involved stationary working environment. Now, it completely changed the way we experience and perceive what we now refer to as time. This concept would not have existed when living in the moment. Every day would have been perceived as cyclical. We would have been sort of continuing in perpetual motion, and so would time in general, daily, weekly, monthly, yearly cycles. But all of our focus would have been on the only real moment that existed, and that's right now. Now, the other negative impact that modern agriculture had is for the first time in our history, we now possessed something. So whether it was that fresh crop out in the field or the harvested product that we now needed to build shelters to store, we had a possession to both nurture and to protect. And I think this was also one that would evidently have been very appealing to the others around us, and that would have led to increasing conflict too. But why is it that we were led to believe that our early ancestors were inferior in so many ways? We're constantly being told that they were worse off than us in every way, but when you really kind of analyse it, it does kind of contradict this. We obviously are told that the life expectancy was very low due to poor health, yet what they always neglect to mention is actually this is mainly due to death in childbirth. Obviously, we didn't have the same sort of facilities in place for childbirth, so that would have brought the average down considerably. But it's not just that. I mean, our ancestors, even with the obvious dangers that they sort of faced with their living environment, they would have actually lived for around about the same time as us, maybe even potentially longer, some people argue. Now, the earth was obviously quite a dangerous place, but it was a far healthier place when you look at everything, soil, abundance of food, air quality, all these kind of things. So obviously there would have been a lot of benefits as well as a lot of negative differences. But it wasn't just conflict. Since we established agriculture, we have also suffered a number of backward steps, evolutionary too. So for the first time in quite a few million years, we actually saw a very slight reduction in our brain size. We also saw issues with regards to facial formation, partly due to the reduction in the chewing of our foods, but also due to the respiratory issues and I suppose nervous system imbalances that this would have kind of led to as well, which we hadn't experienced before. Now, what happens? Our noses became smaller. They became sort of more renounced, more into the face, more constricted. The palate started forming into sort of like a triangular shape, and this sort of further impacted the nasal cavity. We began to see a lot of malocclusion of the teeth, over, underbite. Our faces were quite literally changing shape, and we also, as a bad byproduct of this, we started to breathe through our mouths, which is something that even today indigenous tribes will often refer to as the devil's breath. But the biggest regression that I believe that we experienced was losing the understanding about our innate tribal nature. Now, for millions of years, this nature was kind of intuitively used in a beneficial, cooperative manner, benefiting the tribes and in turn the population. However, with the introduction of possessions and agriculture, we began to lean into the dark side of our tribalism, and I think we became them and us. The conflict which kind of began, I think, as we fought over these new possessions began to amplify. Whereas before we would have travelled constantly, shared the land with others, now we had kind of a stake in that land, and anyone that stumbled onto ours was now seen as a threat. Now, this part of our nature obviously formed organically. But I think in recent times it's been increasingly amplified and used against us by sort of nefarious people that want to capitalise on the division, but that's for a completely different story. So the next time that you're discussing our tribal nature with any of your friends or online, and you're thinking of it as if it's the thing that's going to lead to our doom, forget that conditioning just for a moment and try and realise that it's actually more in our nature to work as a cooperative. I think we have far more in common. I think everybody knows this with one another than we're constantly being led to believe. And despite the obvious and sort of constant abhorrent acts of those in sort of power, this should not be seen as an inevitable part of our nature. They are not the example the human race should be following. There is actually another way, and millions of years of our history kind of proves it. And if you're still struggling to believe what I am saying, just bear in mind the following. We have nearly 8 billion people inhabit this planet. And every single day we have hundreds of billions, potentially even trillions of interactions with one another. And while flashpoints do certainly happen, and they are duly sort of amplified by media, when you take it from a population percentage point of view, it's very clear to see that we really do have it in us to get back to our cooperative tribal nature, which our ancestors enjoyed for millions of years. Now, most of the conflict we see today, I think you will agree, is a direct result of the way of life that we've been forced to endure. It's not natural at all. Now, we know intuitively that life should be for living and a different world is more than possible, but I suppose it means taking responsibility on an individual level to attain that utopia. It's that kill switch that I mentioned earlier. We've been manipulated to believe that the last 10 to 12,000 years is human nature, this conflict. Yet the millions of years that preceded it are kind of ignored, and as far as the main records are concerned, they don't even exist. So to finish up, I'm not suggesting that we all down tools and expect the world to keep turning, but I am suggesting that the human race, as large as the population may be, really does have it in our innate nature to do things very differently. We just need to wake up and take a bit of responsibility. Now, it's not as hard as it seems. Your intuition tells you every time that something does not feel right. You get that feeling in your gut, or your heart tries to tell you something. Instead we're all stuck up here, in our heads, rarely making any sense of all of the chaos constantly being thrown our way. So we ignore it, bury our heads, and just hope that something will magically improve. We need to take a bit more responsibility, listen to our survival mechanisms, but most of all, we need to realise that we do have the power to build a better planet cooperatively. It's human being, not human trying. Hope you enjoyed the show. Cheers, guys. The Alternative Experience.
The Alternative Experience.
The Alternative Experience.